All right. So I'm here with Ted Porter from the Beamer Shop. Ted is West Coast, and
now, formerly East Coast.
Formerly East Coast. Whereabouts?
Yeah, Washington D.C. area, where I grew up.
Okay.
Yeah.
Yeah, I lived in Annapolis for
no kidding
for 23 years. And so we're here to talk about suspension. We're here to talk about what are the suspension needs for an oil head, which we're thinking is 1990 to 2093. 93 to 6.
R1100 RS.
Yeah. So it's a lot of bikes. We have a lot of people on our site. Just to give you some sort of idea, you know, the child, the wonderful child, is Airheads, and they're at about 140,000 views, and we're the stepchild, and we're at 120,000. So we're knocking on their door, and we figure most of them are going to die, you know, pretty soon. So I think we should be all right. So we wanted to talk about suspension, and there are so many different adjustments and things that the shocks do. Can you just clue us in on it, what the hell those things are?
Yeah. Well, we should always start with sag, because anytime we do a suspension seminar, that's where we start. Because it's really important that when you sit on the motorcycle, you're only using up 30% of its stroke. So that's sort of the industry standard, 30% of total travel. And that travel is measured at the wheel, it's not measured at the shock. You're not doing yourself any favors if, when you sit on the bike, you're using up 50% of the stroke. It's the travel that's in the suspension. Yeah. The reason that 30% is the negative side and 70% is the positive side is obviously we need the 70% to absorb the bumps, especially these very high-speed compression events. It can be anything from the extreme as a pothole to just hitting an expansion joint on the highway at 70 miles an hour. You have a very rapid speed of compression and shock, and you don't want to hit the bumper. So if you have 70% left of your travel, there's a good chance you'll absorb that bump and not go into the bumper. But the opposite direction is also important, having that 30% headroom or negative travel, so that as you encounter a dip, again, it can be out on the highway at high speed, you encounter a dip, you want the wheel to be able to drop down into the dip. And you don't want the suspension to top out, lose weight on the tire, lose contact patch. So we want the suspension going up and going down and operating, within that 30% negative, 70% positive travel. So that's how you're going to get your best traction and performance. So that's just setting the sag. That has more to do with the spring, less the shock. That's why we have a hydraulic preload adjuster on the back where your load's carried. That's there for a reason. Ideally, to measure and set your sag, and there's a lot of videos on YouTube showing how to do that.
So when you lift up the rear of the bike to check it and see how it drops.
Well, there's static sag, which is the sag of just the bike sitting of its own weight.
With no rider.
With no rider, and then there's rider sag.
Oh.
And, we can get out into the weeds a little bit about some formulas that we use to determine if spring rate is correct, and, we can kind of, I'll touch on that a little bit. There is a rule of thumb, and it's just a guide that states that after you set your rider sag to 30% of travel, so let's say you've got 135 millimeters travel, like a R1100 RS, for example, 135 millimeters. 30% of that converted into inches is about 1.5 inches. So when the thing is fully extended and you measure from the final drive up to some fixed point on the center stand, you write that number down,
right?
Push it off the center stand, you sit on it. It should drop about 1.5 inches. And you would use your preload adjuster to adjust the spring tension so that you do have that 1.5 inches or 30% rider sag. The 30-10 rule is a guide that we use that states that if your spring rate's correct, if after you set your rider sag to 30% of travel and you get off the bike and you measure static sag, which is, again, subtracting from that first number when the bike was on the center stand,
right? And
you wrote that number down.
Right.
After you set your rider sag by adjusting your preload, now the bike's sitting on its tires. What is that measurement again? subtracting how much the bike is sagging of its own weight.
Yeah.
If that's 10% of your travel, again, the 30-10 rule, you're at 30% rider sag, you've set your sag, 30% of rider sag. If you're now at about 10% static sag, that means the spring rate's correct for you. If the spring rate is too soft for you, you're going to find the static numbers very small. And if you think about it, it makes sense. Because let's say the spring's too soft. You sat on the bike, you adjusted your spring tension until the rider sag was correct. The spring's too soft for you, so you had to dial in a lot of preload. Well, what happens when you get off the bike? All that tension you've added to the spring pushes the bike way up in the air, and the static numbers get very, very small. So that's where that 30-10 rule, and then the opposite's true, right? If you sit on the bike and the spring's too firm for you, you're hardly putting any preload in it at all, because it's a really firm spring. It's too firm for your weight. So when you get off the bike, the static sag numbers are huge, because it really isn't pushing the bike up in the air. You've added very little preload to that spring because that spring is so firm. So that's why we use that 30-10 rule as a guide. Let's say you buy an aftermarket shock and you go set your rider sag, and you want to know if the spring they selected for you is correct. After you set your rider sag, measure your static sag. Are you in that 10% range? Then the spring rate's correct. The reason I say this is only a guide is because it depends on the customer. Maybe that customer carries a passenger frequently. Maybe they really are concerned about capacity. And so they are looking for a stiffer spring.
Capacity meaning luggage and
meaning,
stuff?
yeah, maybe they have a big delta between their minimum and maximum loads. And that customer is looking for a stiffer spring. So that customer might find their static sag is 15% of travel because we chose a stiffer spring.
Right.
So anyway, it's just a good guide. But that's what the spring does. And in terms of adjustments, you have an adjustment that's related to the spring, has nothing to do with the shock. And then you have adjustments that are related to the shock that have nothing to do with the spring. And it's good to kind of separate those in your mind, because spring preload, whether it's an ESA shock and being done electronically or a manual shock being done by turning a knob or sometimes turning a threaded ring with a tool.
ESA is the brand?
ESA is electronic suspension adjust, which came later. Actually, that's more of a hex head thing. Still oil cooled, but that came out in 2005 on the RT. But it's all adjusting the spring tension. And we're not changing the damping, we're just adjusting spring tension. On telelever bikes, you'll find that the front sag doesn't change much. That's why most telelever bikes don't have a front preload adjuster. And if you measured your front sag with loads, with varying loads, you'll find that the front sag really doesn't change very much. And that's why on like an R11S, 1100 RT, what have you, 1150 RT, you'll see no preload adjuster on the front because the sag really doesn't change up front.
I thought they were just being cheap.
Well, yeah, that's true too, but that's another conversation. In fact, what we find is if you're over sagging in the back because of excessive loads in the back, what actually happens in the front is it lifts. You actually have less. I mean, push the bike off center stand, push down on the luggage rack. What happens in the front? It goes up.
Yeah.
It doesn't go down.
Sure.
So it's really all about setting that rear preload and getting the sag set. And then, of course, you can look at the static to see how close is that spring rate for your weight and loads. Moving on to damping, in most cases on street bike applications, you're only going to have a rebound adjuster at the bottom of the shock. And we call it a rebound adjuster, even though it also adjusts compression, but in a smaller amount.
The resistance.
Yeah, because the resistance to compress and to rebound.
To extend. Yeah, okay.
And rebound is something that's actually pretty easy to understand if you have an adjustable rebound shock, because it's visually verifiable. You can see lots of damping or too much damping, and you can see not enough damping. And so when you have a decent shock that has a rebound damping adjuster, we often recommend that customers run the rebound adjuster in. This is the knob at the bottom of the shock. Run it in all the way, tight. Now people will ask, well, what do you mean run it in all the way? Which way? And what I like to say is picture yourself on a ladder screwing a light bulb into the ceiling. Tightening the light bulb means turning it to the right from under the light bulb.
Clockwise.
It's clockwise.
Yeah,
it's the same way with your shock. You're under your shock looking up at it.
Got it.
And you're turning it clockwise. That increases the resistance. It gives you more rebound damping, which is a resistance
Right.
to rebound. So getting back to how to conceptualize this, if you have a good shock, in other words, not the original shock, and you run the rebound adjuster in all the way, and you give it take it off center stand and give it a good shove in the seat, you can see how slowly it rebounds. You have too much rebound damping. There's too much resistance. And what happens when you have too much is that you hit a bump, shock compresses.
It packs.
It packs, which means before the thing rebounds and gets ready for the next bump, you've already hit the next bump.
Yeah.
And so it slowly, gradually starts to pack down. It can even lead to bottoming. We've had cases where customers say, I'm bottoming my shock. We ask them what their rebound setting is, and they'll say, what has that got to do with anything? Well, if you have excessive rebound, it never gets to reset for the next bump, and it just keeps packing down, packing down.
I have totally felt that before. Especially the hard-edge small expansion bumps. You hit it, you know it's not working.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And then, so if you run it in all the way, give it a good shove and watch the rebound. That's too much rebound. And then you run the knob out all the way. You're going to give it a good shove in the seat, and you're going to watch it compress. It's going to rebound. It's going to overshoot free sag. It's going to come back down, and it might even go up one more time before it stops.
So you got a kangaroo.
That's not
going.
enough rebound.
Yeah.
You're riding down the road like a basketball. It's just bouncy, bouncy, bouncy. And when you have lack of damping, I mean, most of us have seen a car going down the road with a blown shock, and the tire, it's just bouncing like a basketball. And it can literally leave the road surface. The tire can literally bounce off the road surface.
Yeah.
So it's dangerous to ride on a shock that's leaking or not set properly, and you start losing rebound. So then the goal is, after you've run it in all the way, and you've seen visually what too much looks like, and out all the way, visually what not enough looks like, then the goal is you start running the rebound adjuster in a click at a time until it still rebounds quickly, but it doesn't overshoot free sag. It pushes down, it comes back up to free sag, and it stops. So now you know that it's going to reset quickly for the next bump.
Right.
The goal is to have the chassis stable and the suspension moving. Not too much damping. The
Right.
whole bike's doing this.
Yeah.
Not enough. You don't have enough control, and the chassis is bouncing around without the
Yep.
suspension.
Yeah.
But if you have the suspension set properly where it's responsive, then the chassis is stable, the suspension moves, but it's not bouncing around. You have good stability. So rebound is easy once you understand that concept. And like I said, I think people can conceptualize it better if they just see what it is. Run it in all the way. Okay, I see. I get it. That's like watching an elevator ascend, right? It's just way too restrictive.
Yeah.
And then the opposite's true. And you don't want either one of those. You want that perfect sweet spot in the middle. And so that's a really good starting point for rebound. Give it a shove in the seat. Does it come up and stop?
Yeah.
I want it to come up fast.
Yeah.
And I want it to stop. Compression is harder to see. Now, only reservoir shocks are going to have a compression adjuster.
So what's a reservoir shock?
A reservoir shock is, well, I just happen to have one.
Okay.
Can you see this in the frame?
Absolutely.
So this is a piggyback reservoir, meaning that it's attached piggyback style to the shock.
Mm-hmm.
There are some fitments where this won't fit. It won't fit in the hole. So
Right.
this will be a remote reservoir. So the reservoir is attached via a hose, and it's attached to the frame somewhere.
Yep.
But the vast majority of reservoir shocks today are going to have one or two compression adjusters. Ideally two, one for high speed, one for low speed. And that's not the speed of the bike, it's the speed of the compression event. So how many millimeters per second did that piston rod, the shiny chrome piston rod, go up inside the shock body because the bump was so abrupt?
Which would be high speed.
High speed. It's a very rapid compression. The thing that goes bang when you, it can be an expansion joint on the highway, just something that makes it compress really, really fast. is the high-speed movement. Low speed is just what it says. It's a lower speed of compression. It could be going over a speed bump, well, unless you hit it really fast, a more rounded bump, a speed bump, chassis movement, just hitting the brakes. I mean, the bike could not even be moving, and you could have a low-speed compression event. You pull up to a stop line, and it goes like that. Well, that's low-speed compression. So you can control chassis movement with the low-speed compression adjuster. Compression, the whole point of compression, like, well, don't we want it to compress? Like, why are we restricting the movement on the compression stroke? Number one, bottoming. Very quick story. We had a customer who had two GS Adventures, both with aftermarket shocks. And he called up and he said, I have these two bikes. Both aftermarket shocks. I need a stiffer spring on one of them. I said, okay, what's the spring rate? And he says, I don't know, how do I find out? And I told him how to read the number. And I said, okay, what does the other bike have? So this one is too stiff. I'm sorry. This one is the firmness that I want. The other one is too soft. I said, okay, what spring do you have on that's correct? He says, it says 160. I said, okay, what does the other one have? He says it's 170. I said, oh, well, that has a stiffer spring. He goes, no, it's softer. I said, no, it's definitely a stiffer spring.
Yeah.
He says, well, I don't understand. Why is it? I said, well, can you send me some pictures or something? So he says, I'll do you one better. He sent me videos. So he's got a video of him pushing down on the back of the one bike with the softer spring, and it clearly is more difficult to compress. And then he did the same on the other bike with the stiffer spring, and it compressed far more easily. And then he went around to the side of the shock. They were both reservoir shocks. I said, aha, this is not a spring rate issue. This is a compression adjustment issue.
Wow.
So one of them has a low-speed compression adjuster that's set in further than the other, and he thinks it's literally a softer spring.
Affecting how it returns.
Yeah, well, in this case, on the compression.
Yeah.
So we asked him to count the clicks, and sure enough, the low-speed compression adjuster on the shock that had the stiffer spring, that he said was too soft, was because the low-speed compression adjuster was run all the way out.
Like forensics.
What's that?
It's like forensics.
Sometimes
you're
we
trying
have
to
to
figure out who
detectives,
done it. Yeah.
So in that case, we reset his compression for him over the phone. He did the work, and then he goes, "Oh my God, it's way better now." I said, "Yeah, it's not a spring issue." So the resistance to compress helps with bottoming, because he says, "I'm blowing through the stroke too fast. I need a stiffer spring." No, you actually need a compression adjustment.
Yeah.
So it helps with bottoming. It also helps on the downward slope of the bump. We want the tire to, you're hitting the upward slope, the shock compresses. On the downward slope, we want the tire to stay in contact with the ground. And then there's the issue of momentum. When you hit that bump and the shock compresses, it can sort of, without compression damping, it can sort of continue to compress. It can loft over the top of the bump. So if we slow down the compression event with some damping, the tire will follow the downward slope of that bump. You'll maintain better traction.
Got it.
So the high speed, the low speed is a needle valve, just like the rebound adjuster is. So you're opening and closing a hole that the oil goes through. The high speed, and it depends on the shock brand, because we sell 7 brands and they have their differences. But in most cases, this, what I refer to as the Dutch circuit, it's very common on most of the shocks which are coming out of Holland, which is most of the shocks. It acts more like a pressure relief valve. It's a spring-loaded valve. The adjuster is adjusting the tension on the spring. So this stays closed. The oil on the compression stroke goes into the reservoir down the low speed until the velocity at some point overcomes the tension that's on this high-speed valve, the spring tension.
Okay.
And then once it gets to a certain amount of compression speed, and that is the velocity of it coming into the top of the reservoir, it's going too fast to go down the low-speed circuit, which has been optimized for low-speed events. So the high-speed valve starts to open. the oil velocity sort of overcomes that little spring and it starts bleeding that pressure, allowing that pressure to bleed off into the reservoir rather than feeding that force back up into the frame.
Wow, that's really sophisticated.
It is. That's how I describe this. People say, well, do I need a reservoir or not? And we always say, well, let's find out what your needs are. We try and meet your needs at the lowest. We don't want you to overbuy. We don't want you to underbuy either.
Yeah.
Let's meet your needs. Then sometimes people need a reservoir, like for GSs. Sometimes they don't need it, but they might want it in the respect of more tunability, better ride quality, because like you just said, it's a more sophisticated circuit. And so now you have control over the high speed, which would be washboard, just crappy roads in general.
Sure.
You can have this valve open sooner. Or if you're blowing through the stroke and bottoming, and which is really more off-road, more GS kind of riding, then you can increase the tension on that spring. So that's it in a nutshell.
So is there any difference in shock design, really, not settings, which I think is probably your answer, but in shock designs that are for off-road or street?
Yeah, materials, design to a large extent, especially in the preloader on the rear shock. First, I would say materials. Shocks can be made out of steel or hard anodized forged aluminum. Steel doesn't shed the heat as well. But oil capacity is far more important, honestly, than the material. The material is important, but we have to start with oil capacity because a non-reservoir shock is only half full of oil, because the other half of the tube is where the nitrogen goes. When you have a reservoir, the nitrogen is in the reservoir. So now the shock is 100% full of oil. So just like draining half the coolant out of your car's radiator, obvious, I don't know how good of an analogy that is, but anyway, when it's got 100% full of oil tube, it's going to shed the heat
so shock
better.
compresses. That oil has got to go somewhere because it's just taking up space. The shock compresses.
Yeah, well, in this case, when it's a non-reservoir. Well, hold that question. Let me get back to the oil capacity.
Okay.
Just want to make sure I'm clear on that. But the reason that street riding versus dirt off-road riding, and it can just be dirt roads. It doesn't have to be anything wild and crazy.
Right.
Riding on dirt roads increases the compression speeds. The physics of it are that on the compression stroke, the energy is stored in the spring. On the rebound stroke, the energy is converted into heat. So the more we cycle it, the hotter it gets.
Yeah.
That's what happens when you're on dirt and gravel roads. It just cycles more. When it's a non-reservoir shock, it's only half full of oil. When it's reservoir shock, it's 100% full of oil. So we just have more oil capacity. The other factor in terms of design is whether or not we're allowing the gas molecules to be in the oil, which is an emulsion design, where there's no piston separating the oil and the gas. There are advantages to that in certain cases. It's really hard to not get overly technical here.
No, well, I mean, they love that stuff.
Okay, all right.
Yeah, they love that
So let's start with emulsion versus IFP, which is internal floating piston. So when you don't have a reservoir, which most street bikes don't need a reservoir, you start with emulsion design, which means the piston rod assembly and piston is shoved up into this tube, it's filled with oil, and it's given a shot of nitrogen. The nitrogen molecules are in the oil and in the space where there's no oil. So it emulsifies together. When you have really light spring rates and low damping forces, they can ride better when you don't have a separation piston in there. The gas molecules are sort of thinning the oil.
Kind of automatically adjusts the compression to some extent?
No, I'm just saying in terms of how do we get the shock to ride comfortably when and again, I could get really technical here, but when the leverage ratios are very low, like a twin shock bike, let's say. Okay, and this is getting out of the realm of oil heads a little bit, but where the shock is mounted way towards the rear, towards the center of the axle. So it's almost one-to-one. When the wheel moves, the shock moves the same amount. Okay, those spring rates are really soft. The damping is really, really soft. And the internal floating piston does take up a little bit of energy to move the piston, right, when the shock compresses. And you almost can't valve those things lightly enough to make them ride. Like the shim stacks get really thin and can even deform the shims.
Those are the little washers that are inside the shock.
They're on top of the piston and they deflect as the oil goes through the piston.
Yeah.
When we do an emulsion design, it thins the oil, and there's no internal floating piston that takes up energy getting it to move. So sometimes emulsion shocks, especially on the front of a telelever bike, if it's not being ridden off-road, it's not a GS, sometimes an emulsion on the front will ride better than an internal floating piston. Okay, internal floating piston, because there are some downsides. The problem with an emulsion design is when you get it hot, there's this thing called vapor pressure. As the vapor pressure, as the oil temperature rises, the vapor pressure drops, and that gas starts coming out of the oil. It's starting to bubble and foam. It's called cavitation.
So they do cavitation, almost like a propeller on a boat.
I don't know anything about it.
So air gets in between the propeller and the water, and then all of a sudden it loses its bite.
Okay.
Yeah, it's cavitating.
Cavitating.
Yeah.
So to prevent cavitation, we get the gas. And that's a whole nother, I mean, there's a big topic on cavitation. So we'll leave that one there.
We just don't want it.
Yeah, you just don't want it.
We don't want it.
Exactly.
Right, okay.
Yeah, on GS models, particularly on the rear and even on the front where they can get warm, we want to keep the gas molecules out of the oil to prevent that cavitation that we were talking about. So that's when we get into internal floating piston. The gas molecules are separated from the oil. The oil can shed its heat to the cylinder wall. And then ideally we have a different kind of cylinder wall material. Instead of steel, we have aluminum, because the aluminum sheds the heat better. So if you want a fighting chance of not overheating a non-reservoir shock on a bike that's on dirt roads and the shock temperature's going up, then you want an internal floating piston, forged aluminum shock.
Got it.
If it's 1100 GS, 1150 GS, and you're spending a lot of time on dirt and gravel, and shock temperature is a concern, that's when we go reservoir to increase the oil capacity. And then, of course, we pick up the compression adjusters and all the benefits of the compression adjusters. We did an interesting experiment recently. In our training, we go to Europe for training, Germany and Holland, and we've long known that shock oil, once it gets up to a certain temperature, it's permanently damaged. Okay, just because the shock cooled off doesn't mean that the damping is going to return to how the shock was originally designed.
It's ruined the oil.
It's ruined the oil. We recently had an opportunity to test this. We had a shock that a customer said got quite hot off-road, and that he thought there was something defective with the shock because the damping never really returned for the way he liked to ride this bike on BDRs and so forth. So we got the shock back, and we looked at it internally, and everything was fine internally. So we decided to run it on the shock dyno, and we consulted with the shock manufacturer, and they said, yeah, run it on your dyno, get it hot, use a heat gun to get it hot quickly and get the shock temperature up, get it above 200 degrees, and watch the damping curves on the shock dyno. And sure enough, they fell off, okay? And we expected, and this is synthetic shock oil. It's designed to take some abuse, but it did fall off. But the interesting thing was, after it cooled off, the damping did not come back to where it was before.
Isn't that interesting? Wow.
So we took it apart, put fresh shock oil in it, didn't change anything else, ran it on the dyno, the damping came back to where it was supposed to be. So we proved what we had been taught in training, that if you get the shock hot enough, you will permanently damage the oil, you will ruin the oil. So that's why when you take a non-reservoir shock and put it on a GS and go do BDRs and the Intercontinental Divide Tour and go into Baja and you want to buy this cheap shock, you know, I've had people ask me that, like, here's how I plan to use it, what's your cheapest shock? Like, I'm sorry, but those two things don't go together.
They never seem to. I don't know why that happens.
Yeah, you need the right tool for the job.
Yeah.
And that's why I say we don't want you to overbuy, but not underbuy either.
Yeah.
And sometimes the tool you need is going to cost you a little bit of money, but it's the right tool. And now you can go anywhere and do anything. And you know, there's another advantage to these shocks that are designed more for adventure use, because you'd asked me about design.
Right.
And another one is the seal head. So most shocks, you know, at the very bottom, there's a seal.
Right.
At the bottom of the tube, and it's got a bushing that keeps the shaft in the center of the body.
Right.
And it's got the seals. It's got a scraper seal to keep the dirt off. It's got its main seal. There's no ring around it, and so on. So when we put these together, the assembly goes in, and the circlip goes in place, and then the gas pressure pushes the seal head against the clip, as long as you have gas pressure. So what happens if gas pressure goes down and you're in the middle of South America? The seal head starts shuttling up and down because there's no gas pressure to hold it against the clip. So, and that damages the piston, damages the body. It can even make the shock trash.
Huh.
That's why we always say don't ride on a shock that's leaking.
Yeah.
Because you can, you know, cost you a lot more money to fix it, you know, later.
Yeah.
So what some companies did, Tractor for example, is they threaded their seal head. It's also a reinforced seal head. There's a little thing under the lip so it can take high compression speeds, high heat, and so forth. But they also thread the inside of it so that when you normally you tap the cap on with a hammer on most other brands.
Right.
This one threads on. So the seal head goes against the clip like it normally would, but inside it are threads, and the cap's threaded. So as you screw the cap on, it pulls the seal head down against the clip, and it keeps the seal head stationary.
Regardless of pressure.
Regardless of pressure.
That's wild.
So there are a variety of things that can be done to make a shock better, even though you line them all up and they might all look the same.
Right.
They're not the same, and it depends on the use.
Right.
Because you could have, for one particular application, a very basic steel cylinder emulsion shock is going to be a huge upgrade.
Yeah.
But you put that same shock on a GS, and you might overheat it and blow seals and self-destruct if the gas pressure goes down.
Right.
So then you need different materials, different design, and so forth.
So what's up with this telelever? I mean, we have a lot of them, and you know, other than them collecting dirt and a variety of other things.
Yeah.
And we do basically understand that the forks are only really holding the wheel on and allowing you to steer it.
Yeah.
And all of the compression and rebound and everything else is happening within that one shock.
In the shock. Yeah.
So
yeah, that's exactly right. And you know, it works as advertised, right? You know, it separates all those different forces, you know, braking and suspension from steering and so on.
Right.
And the other thing that's interesting is how the different weights and loads on these bikes have so little effect on front sag. And that's why when you buy a rear shock, there are 6 or 7 springs, actually for sidecar applications, even more springs for the rear, because so much of the load's carried back there. But up front, generally speaking, everybody gets the same spring. People don't want to hear that.
Really?
But it's the reality.
Yeah.
And you can see this in the sag numbers. You put a 150-pound person on the bike and measure the front sag.
Right.
And put a 250-pound person and measure the front sag.
Very close numbers.
Yeah. In fact, if you don't set the rear sag, it's going to lift the front. It's not going to push it down further. So that's another reason why rear sag is so important. We didn't even talk about trail, contact patch of the front tire, weight on the front tire. All those things are so important, and they're determined by the rear sag.
Huh.
So
interesting.
Yeah, that's a whole other topic.
So then you don't need, for street purposes, you don't need an emulsion shock. Could be enough.
Shock's plenty fine for the front. It's nice to have damping adjustability. You don't need preload adjustability on the front shock, but all the aftermarket shocks are going to give you that with a threaded ring. And you can play with it if you want to affect handling, steering geometry. We had a 1150 RT rider who he was so intent on making sure I understood his riding style, he sent me a video. And he said, you need to understand how I ride this thing. And I want to improve the handling. I want to upgrade the shocks, but it's a matter of steering geometry. So yeah, the guy hardly ever gets out of third gear. It's just twisties and twisties and twisties and twisties. So we actually increased his front sag so that the trail would shorten up and the bike would tuck into the turns better.
Right.
And he loved it. At first he thought, that sounds so counterintuitive. But once I explained to him the effect the trail was going to have, and we made that adjustment on the front, he absolutely loves it.
Yeah.
So you have the ability to do that with an aftermarket shock. Obviously, the original shock's not going to have preload unless it's a GS, where the GS models give you on the original shock, they give you a ramped adjuster, so that you can, gain ground clearance. You have to be careful with that though, because we've seen cases where the guy ends up he cranks the front end up, and then he doesn't have enough negative travel, and he wonders why he's losing traction when he's on dirt and gravel roads doing some more technical stuff in rough conditions. Well, the shock's topping out.
Yeah.
It's too high up in its travel. The negative travel has gone to nothing, and now when the tire tries to drop down into a dip, it loses traction. And he's losing weight, so the contact patch is an issue. The only time that's a benefit is in sand. In sand, trainers will tell you, lean back on the bike, get your weight off the front end, keep your speed up.
Yeah.
And so by lifting the front end up, you are effectively doing that. You're weight transferring off the front.
You're floating the tire over the sand, the front tire.
Yeah.
Yeah.
But in most cases, that's not what you want. You want, especially on the street.
Yeah.
Contact patch is important, and weight on the front tire is important. And so you don't want to be doing that to the bike, turning it into a chop or extending the trail, which makes it just want to go straight.
Right.
People will say, I feel like I'm pushing through the turns, like the thing just doesn't want to turn. What's your sag? I don't know. Okay, well, let's find out what your sag is.
It's interesting coming from road racing and never having a suspension like what's on my R1100S. I mean, a telelever. That's what we counted on, is coming into a corner, collapse the front suspension, and whip it, because it allows you to change direction quickly.
Yeah.
This thing, you could drop a truck on it, and it's only going to move, a couple inches.
Yeah, so it's important to not offload the front end and make sure that the sag is correct in the back.
Yeah.
So that the weight on the front is correct.
Yeah.
So and the steering geometry is correct, because that also affects the sag. I mean the trail, obviously.
Right. And so on the shocks that you sell, you have several.
Yeah, we have, I think,
brands.
7 brands. There's actually 2 more brands that just aren't even on our site. So we have quite a catalog of options.
So on rebuilding them, the only shocks you sell are ones that you can rebuild?
Oh yeah,
service?
all rebuildable, yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
And that means, I guess the parts are available.
Yeah.
And you can actually interchange them.
Yeah, that's the advantage of the aftermarket, is all the parts are available. There are shops out there that will service the original shock, and I say that because I think using the word rebuild to me means something.
Yeah.
It's about all the wear parts.
Yeah.
And I've seen examples where it's claimed that you're getting your shock rebuilt, but actually you're getting a new X-ring seal inside the seal head, because you can't buy a seal head, and your oil's being changed. And that's it.
Yeah.
It's not a rebuild.
Yeah.
So, and then, if you need a hard part later, let's say you invest in it and you have the stock shock serviced, and then you need an eyelet, you need a spherical bearing, you need some of them don't even have spherical bearings, they just have rubber bushings, in the eyelets.
Yeah.
They're just built so cheaply. Or you need a piston rod. You can't buy those parts. So now it's going into the dumpster, and all your money invested in rebuilding kind of goes down the drain.
So a worn shock then either, could have the oil that's inside it ruined from a variety of different things.
Yeah.
And then the myriad of seals and bushings are worn,
Right.
and they're not sealing correctly. right?
Yeah, one
So-
example would be the piston band. You know, there is a piston in there that seals inside the cylinder.
Right.
And the idea is to make sure that that seals so that the oil goes through the valving. And what happens is as that piston band wears, the oil starts, you know, escaping where the piston band seals.
Okay.
So it's sort of like rings on a piston inside the engine. You know,
Right.
you want those rings to seal. And it goes up and down every time, you know, you take it off the center stand, that piston band's going up and
Can't
down.
control it now.
So
Yeah.
it wears.
Yeah.
And then the oil does lose viscosity normally, even if you don't overheat it. I mean, just like, because it has to deal with shear. It's like the oil in your engine will lose viscosity over time.
Yeah.
So all those things wear, and also the performance drops so gradually. You don't even know it's happening.
Yeah.
You know, if it's not leaking, that is.
Yeah.
And then you upgrade to something quality, and it's,
Night
one
and
guy
day.
used the word transformational.
Yeah.
I've started using that
Yeah.
that word. So yeah, suspension's everything. It's what keeps the tire on the ground. It
Yeah.
affects your chassis movement, your handling, your ride quality, your comfort. I knew a guy with a K12 RS that was going to sell the bike, and I tried to talk him out of it. Why would you put new shocks on a bike you're going to sell? And he said, that's just the way I am. I want it nice. And after we put shocks on it, he said, this is a completely different
I'm not going to
I'm
sell
not
it.
selling it. So it means, and you know, in most cases you can do one at a time. And I always tell people, look, if you're not sure, in most cases the rear shock is doing all the work, carrying all the load. It's going to have the higher stresses, damping forces, and the force of the spring against the preloader, all that stuff. So start there.
Okay.
And also keep in mind that a quality aftermarket shock does not lose all of its value. You know, keep the stock shock. If you sell the bike later, take the aftermarket shock off the bike. You'll probably get at least half your money back.
Right.
Because there's demand and there's very little supply of the good stuff.
So many of the shocks could be adjusted to fit a new bike.
Yeah, so as long as it's the same model,
Oh, okay.
you know, all R1100 RSs. You know, I'd have to think of some other examples, but off the top of my head, this is a hex head, not an oil head, but 05 to 13 R1200 RTs. Okay, completely interchangeable. As long as you're taking the ESA off, and ESA is a whole other conversation. But a lot of those riders are taking ESA off because we're starting to have some reliability issues with the electrics as those bikes age.
Yeah.
And the bike doesn't care. So there'll be no warnings on the display. Just take it off.
Right.
And put manual shocks on. Well, if you sell your 05 and buy a 2013, you take the shocks with you.
Yeah. Why not?
Yeah.
All
So.
right. Anything else you want to tell us?
Oh God, I could go on for hours
I
about
know.
suspension.
Well, appreciate you doing it.
My pleasure.
I appreciate also, because I know you show up for these events every year and put your ass on a plane and get over here and do this whole thing. And we totally appreciate it. And, you know, the effort and the service that you provide to our group.
Thank you.
So, thanks.
Thank you. My pleasure.
All right.
Thanks a lot.
All right, man.